I'll stream that new T.I., man, that new T.I. shit, right one, that shit on fire. Tip, we want to see them old schools at the car show. ATL, let Tip know after y'all stream that new shit, that shit hot.
What if 3 simple words could detonate a bomb in the middle of one of hip-hop's biggest ongoing wars? Not a diss track, not a press run, not even a full sentence. Just 3 words dropped casually in a comment section that somehow managed to stop the entire internet in its tracks. We are talking about Rick Ross, a man who has spent years circling the edges of the 50 Cent versus T.I. rivalry like a shark waiting for the right moment to bite. And when that moment finally arrived, he did not show up with a verse or a press statement. He showed up with 3 words that fans immediately started screenshotting, reposting, and dissecting like it was the Zapruder film. Within hours, those 3 words were on every blog, every podcast intro, every group chat notification. People who had not paid attention to hip-hop drama in years suddenly found themselves refreshing their feeds waiting for what came next. And what came next was something nobody fully predicted. Because those 3 words did not just comment on the war between T.I. and 50 Cent. They may have just officially announced which side Rick Ross is standing on. And if that is true, then the entire dynamic of this rivalry just changed forever. Stay locked in because this story is only getting started. To understand why those 3 words hit so differently, you have to go back a little and understand the landscape that made this moment possible. The tension between T.I. and 50 Cent is not something that was born overnight. It has been simmering for years, occasionally boiling over in interviews, on social media, and in the kind of passive-aggressive industry commentary that hip-hop fans have learned to read between the lines. Both men are legends in their own right. Both have built empires that extend far beyond music. Both have reputations that they guard fiercely, and both have made it very clear over the years that when it comes to their name and their legacy, they do not back down easily. So when things started heating up again recently, nobody was completely surprised. What surprised people was the scale of what followed. It started with King, T.I.'s son, stepping into the conversation in a way that immediately got attention. This was not just a young artist trying to ride his father's coattails into a controversy. King came in with energy and intention, dropping a track that made a bold statement and showed he was not interested in playing it safe. Fans immediately started paying attention because there is something uniquely compelling about watching the next generation enter a battle that the previous generation started. The emotional stakes feel different, the personal investment feels deeper, and when King's track started circulating, people began asking whether this was a solo move or something more coordinated. The answer came quickly. Tia followed up with her own response, and suddenly the conversation shifted. This was no longer just about T.I. and 50 Cent trading indirect shots through interviews and social media posts. This was a family stepping forward together, and that visual alone changed the entire narrative. People who had been casually following the drama suddenly became deeply invested, because there is something primal about watching a family close ranks. Whether you agreed with their position or not, the image of a united front was impossible to ignore. Blogs picked it up immediately, podcasts started dedicating entire episodes to breaking it down, and then Dominique came through with Miss Jackson, and the internet genuinely lost its mind. Miss Jackson was not just a diss track, it was a statement. The title alone carried weight because anyone with even a passing knowledge of hip-hop history understood the reference it was pulling from. The cover art featuring a burning house added another layer of symbolism that fans immediately started interpreting in a dozen different ways. Some said it represented destruction, others said it represented purging something old to make room for something new. A few people argued it was simply dramatic imagery designed to generate conversation, and if that was the goal, it worked perfectly. The comment sections across every platform exploded, the theories multiplied, and the 3 tracks together, King's opening shot, Tia's response, and Dominique's Miss Jackson, created a wave of content that dominated timelines for days. Now here's where the story starts to get genuinely interesting, because while all of this was unfolding, one figure who had been relatively quiet suddenly became very visible. Rick Ross had history with 50 Cent that needed no introduction. Their tension had played out publicly over years, through diss tracks, through interviews, through the kind of sustained back and forth that becomes part of hip-hop mythology. Fans who had followed both careers closely knew that whenever 50 Cent's name came up in a new controversy, Ross was never far from the conversation. But there
is a difference between being expected to show up and actually showing up in a way that shifts the entire story. And when Ross showed up this time, he did not do it with a verse or a statement. He did it with comments. Specific, targeted, perfectly timed comments that told you everything you needed to know about where he stood, without him ever having to spell it out directly. His first move was under King's photo, the one featuring the now viral t-shirt design that had already been generating enormous amounts of discussion on its own. Ross dropped a comment that fans immediately started screenshotting, and the energy behind that comment was unmistakable. He was not just acknowledging what King had done, he was co-signing it. He was putting his name and his reputation behind the move, and in hip-hop, that means something significant. When an artist of Ross's stature publicly aligns himself with one side of a rivalry, it sends a message to everyone watching. It tells you that this is not just a family dispute anymore. It tells you that the circles are widening and the stakes are getting higher. But Ross did not stop there. He went to Dominique's post next and dropped another comment, this one even more expressive and enthusiastic than the first. And fans took notice of that pattern immediately. This was not a single impulsive comment from someone who got caught up in the moment. This was a series of deliberate, visible moves that showed Ross was tracking the situation closely and choosing exactly when and where to make himself known. The calculation behind it was almost as impressive as the comments themselves, because Ross understood something that a lot of people were just starting to figure out. In this era of hip-hop drama, the comment section is a battlefield just as real and consequential as any recording studio. What made his involvement land so hard was the timing. The 3 diss tracks from T.I.'s family had already created enormous momentum. The internet was already buzzing at a frequency that was hard to ignore. And then Ross stepped in and essentially added rocket fuel to a fire that was already burning bright. His comments were not lengthy, they were not complicated, but they carried the full weight of his history with 50 Cent and his reputation in the culture, and that weight was felt immediately across every platform where the conversation was happening. Entertainment blogs that had been covering the family's diss tracks suddenly had a new angle to work with. Podcast hosts who had been debating the lyrics of Miss Jackson suddenly had a new question to answer. And fans who had been picking sides between T.I.'s family and 50 Cent suddenly had to factor in what it meant that Rick Ross was now visibly and enthusiastically in the mix. The internet's reaction was immediate and divided in the most entertaining way possible. Some people said Ross's involvement was the natural extension of a beef that had never really ended. Others argued that he was opportunistically inserting himself into a moment that was not originally about him. A few voices suggested that his presence actually complicated things for 50 Cent in a way that went beyond just the optics. Because now the narrative was no longer about one family challenging one artist. It was starting to look like a coalition, and coalitions in hip-hop have historically been very difficult to navigate for even the most experienced and battle-tested artists. The question that everyone started asking was simple but enormous. Was Rick Ross just cheering from the sidelines, or was he preparing to step onto the field himself? And nobody had a definitive answer yet, which meant the conversation kept going and the anticipation kept building with every passing hour. The anticipation was doing something interesting to the online conversation because it was splitting people into very distinct camps. And those camps were not just divided along the lines of who they preferred musically, they were divided along deeper lines of philosophy and strategy. On one side, you had the people who believed that what T.I.'s family had done was genuinely unprecedented in modern hip-hop. 3 tracks from 3 different family members released in close succession, each one carrying its own distinct energy and perspective, all of them pointing in the same direction. That kind of coordinated creative output requires trust, communication, and a shared sense of purpose that most families, let alone most rap collectives, struggle to maintain under normal circumstances. The fact that it happened during a live and active beef made it even more remarkable to the people who were paying close attention. On the other side, you had the voices who were firmly in 50 Cent's corner, and those voices were not backing down just because the numbers seemed stacked against their guy at the moment. They kept coming back to one core argument that was hard to dismiss entirely: experience. They pointed out that
50 Cent had been through rivalries that made this one look like a rehearsal. He had gone toe-to-toe with artists who were at the absolute peak of their cultural power, and had not just survived, but emerged stronger and more visible on the other side. His entire brand was built on the mythology of being unbeatable in these situations, and his supporters argued that 3 diss tracks from a family unit, no matter how well executed, was not going to crack that foundation. They were watching and waiting for him to make his move, fully confident that when it came, it would reset the entire conversation. What was fascinating to observe was how 50 Cent himself was navigating all of this in real time. Because he was not silent, he was active on social media, dropping posts and commentary that showed he was fully aware of everything that was being said and done. But his approach was conspicuously different from what his opponents were doing. While King and Dominique were going into the studio and coming out with tracks that could be streamed and shared and analyzed bar by bar, 50 Cent was operating in a different register entirely. He was using humor. He was using memes. He was using the kind of sharp and slightly detached commentary that has always been one of his most effective tools. The ability to seem unbothered while clearly being very bothered, and to turn that performance of unbotheredness into its own kind of power move. His supporters loved it. They argued that by refusing to respond with a traditional diss track, he was essentially communicating that he did not view the situation as a threat serious enough to require that kind of effort. They said he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, and that his social media presence during this period was itself a form of dominance. His critics, however, saw the same behavior through a completely different lens. They said the humor and the memes were a deflection. They said that when you are facing 3 diss tracks from 3 members of the same family, and the best you can do is post jokes, you have already conceded the lyrical battlefield, even if you would never admit it out loud. The debate between these 2 interpretations was generating almost as much heat as the original tracks themselves. And then Rick Ross made his 3rd move. After the comments under King's photo and Dominique's post, Ross returned to social media and dropped another message that was short enough to fit on a bumper sticker, but loud enough to echo across every corner of the internet where this story was being discussed. He wrote that Miss Jackson was hot. 3 words. That was it. And those 3 words became the most talked about phrase in hip-hop circles for the next 24 hours. Not because they were complicated or cryptic, precisely because they were not. The simplicity of the statement was what made it devastating, because it left absolutely no room for interpretation. Ross was not hinting at support or suggesting alignment or carefully positioning himself to walk back his comments if the situation changed. He was saying plainly and publicly that what Dominique had done with Miss Jackson was quality, was significant, was worthy of attention and praise. And by extension, he was saying that the side which produced it was winning. The blogs did not wait. Within minutes of Ross's comment being spotted, screenshots were circulating on every platform simultaneously. Fan accounts were reposting it with captions that ranged from celebratory to apocalyptic, depending on which side of the divide the account owner was on. Media outlets that cover hip-hop drama were publishing articles faster than their editors could review them. And regular fans who had been following the story since King dropped his first track were now feeling the full weight of what was happening. This was no longer a family beef that had gone public. This was a multi-front cultural moment, with one of hip-hop's most recognizable and controversial figures throwing his weight behind one side in the most visible way possible, short of recording his own diss track. What nobody had fully accounted for was how this would affect the emotional temperature of the people directly involved. Because behind all the blogs and the screenshots and the stream counts and the social media analysis, there were real people navigating something genuinely intense. King had put himself out there in a way that required real courage, regardless of how you felt about the content of what he was saying. Stepping into a public beef as the son of a legend carries a specific kind of pressure that is different from anything a regular debut artist faces. Every bar you write is going to be measured against your father's legacy. Every delivery is going to be picked apart by fans who remember what the previous generation sounded like at their best. And every move you make is going to be read as either a reflection of or a departure from
values that your family has publicly represented for decades. King did it anyway, and the response he received, both the criticism and the praise, was enormous in scale. Dominique's situation carried its own distinct emotional weight. He had been described by fans and commentators as the most lyrically gifted of the family members who had stepped into the conversation, and that description came with expectations attached. When you are labeled the skilled one, the bar is automatically set higher than it would be for someone entering the same situation without that reputation preceding them. Miss Jackson had to be good. It had to be sharper and more layered than what had come before it. And by most assessments from people who engaged with it closely, it delivered on that expectation. But delivering on that expectation while your family is at the center of a very public and very heated beef is not a neutral creative experience. There is emotion running through that kind of work that you cannot fully separate from the technical execution, and fans who listened carefully said they could hear it in every line. Tia's contribution to the sequence had also been generating its own conversation, one that was somewhat separate from the debate about lyrical skill and strategic timing. Her presence in the lineup of responses meant that this was not just a father and his sons circling the wagons, it was a broader family expression of solidarity. And that added a dimension to the story that made it feel less like a conventional rap beef and more like something that was genuinely personal in a way that went beyond music. People online were divided about how to process that. Some said it made the response more powerful and more human. Others said it complicated the narrative in ways that made it harder to evaluate purely on the terms that hip-hop traditionally uses to judge these kinds of exchanges. But everyone agreed that Tia's involvement changed the texture of what was happening in a way that was impossible to ignore. Through all of this, the figure who remained most difficult to read was 50 Cent himself. His social media activity continued at a steady pace. His humor remained sharp. His supporters remained loud and confident. But underneath all of that, people who had been watching him carefully for years said they noticed something in the pattern of his posts that suggested he was doing more than just performing unbotheredness. They said he was watching, he was cataloging, he was taking inventory of every move being made on the other side, with the kind of focused attention that precedes a very deliberate and very calculated response. Whether that response would come in the form of music or something else entirely was the question that was keeping fans on both sides of the divide locked into their feeds and their notifications with an intensity that showed no signs of slowing down.
The intensity was not slowing down, and if anything, it was finding new directions to travel in, because stories like this one never stay contained to the original boundaries that defined them when they first broke. They expand, they pull in new characters and new subplots and new angles that nobody anticipated when the first shot was fired. And this situation was following that pattern with remarkable consistency. What had started as a family responding to a beef through coordinated music releases had now grown into a sprawling cultural conversation that was touching on questions about loyalty, legacy, the rules of engagement in modern hip-hop, and the way that social media has fundamentally changed what it means to win or lose a public dispute. Every day brought something new to analyze, and every new development sent fans back to the beginning to re-examine everything that had come before it with fresh eyes. One of the threads that started gaining serious traction online was the historical context that people were layering onto the current situation. Hip-hop has always had a relationship with its own history that is unlike any other genre of music. Fans do not just listen to old records for nostalgia, they study them, they reference them, they use them as the foundation for understanding everything that comes after. And so when Dominique titled his track Miss Jackson, it was inevitable that people would start pulling up every relevant historical moment that the title could be connected to. The most obvious connection was to Ja Rule's public letter to 50 Cent's mother during their legendary rivalry years ago, a moment that became one of the most discussed and debated moves in the entire history of rap beef culture. Some people saw Dominique's title as a direct and intentional nod to that history. Others said the connection was being overread by fans who were looking for patterns that were not necessarily there. But the conversation itself was valuable because it forced people to think carefully about the traditions and precedents that
how these conflicts unfold. The Ja Rule and 50 Cent rivalry was being discussed with a level of detail and enthusiasm that suggested a lot of people had been waiting for an excuse to revisit it. Clips from that era were resurfacing on fan pages and reaction channels. Old interviews where both artists addressed the beef were being watched by people who were too young to have experienced them in real time. And the comparisons between that rivalry and the current one were generating genuinely interesting debates about how much the culture had changed and how much had stayed the same. The tools were different now, the speed was different, the scale of the audience was different, but the fundamental human dynamics, the pride, the loyalty, the desire to protect your name and your family, those had not changed at all. And that continuity was what made the historical conversations feel relevant, rather than merely nostalgic. Beanie Sigel and Jadakiss were also being brought back into the conversation, and their connections to 50 Cent's past rivalries were being analyzed alongside the current situation with a thoroughness that spoke to how deep hip-hop fans' institutional memory runs. People were pointing out patterns in how 50 Cent had navigated different kinds of opposition over the years, drawing lines between his early career moves and his current social media strategy to argue that his approach had always been fundamentally consistent, even as the platforms and the context around him changed. His supporters used these historical comparisons to reinforce their confidence that he would find a way to turn the current situation to his advantage. His critics used the same history to argue that the current situation was genuinely different from anything he had faced before, and that his old playbook might not be adequate for a scenario this specific and this emotionally loaded. The Styles P connection was another thread that kept surfacing in these historical discussions, and it was interesting because it highlighted a dimension of 50 Cent's competitive history that was less frequently discussed than his more famous rivalries. People were going back to moments that had played out publicly between them and reading those moments through the lens of the current situation, looking for clues about how 50 Cent processed opposition and what it took to genuinely get under his skin versus what he was able to dismiss or absorb without significant damage to his public standing. These were not simple questions, and the people engaging with them were not looking for simple answers. They were trying to build a complete picture of who 50 Cent was as a competitor, and the current situation was giving them fresh material to work with, while simultaneously sending them back to everything that had come before. Meanwhile, the Aisha Diaz angle had entered the conversation and added a dimension that shifted the emotional register of the entire discussion in a significant way. Reports about a $50,000 per month figure had started circulating online, and the reactions were immediate and deeply divided. Some people engaged with the claim skeptically, questioning the context and the sourcing and the motivations behind why this particular piece of information was entering the conversation at this particular moment. Others took it at face value and used it to frame the broader conflict in terms of financial power and personal obligation. And a third group, perhaps the most perceptive, pointed out that regardless of whether the specific claims were accurate or verifiable, their presence in the conversation was itself meaningful, because it showed how quickly these public disputes expand beyond the original creative and competitive dimensions into territory that feels genuinely personal and genuinely high stakes for real people. The way fans were processing all of these different threads simultaneously said something important about how hip-hop drama functions in the social media era. It is not a single story anymore. It is a constellation of interconnected stories that people engage with according to their own interest and priorities. Some fans were focused almost entirely on the music, debating bars and delivery and production choices with the kind of granular attention that would impress any music critic. Others were focused on the strategic dimension, treating the whole situation like a chess match, and trying to anticipate the next move from each side based on the patterns they had identified.
Still others were most interested in the human and emotional dimension, the family dynamics, the personal stakes, the way that public beefs inevitably involve private pain that leaks through no matter how carefully the people involved try to control their image. Rick Ross continued to be a presence throughout all of this, and what was becoming increasingly clear was that his involvement was not accidental or impulsive. Every comment he
dropped, every post he had engaged with, followed a logic that pointed toward a consistent and deliberate strategy. He was not just showing support for T's family out of spontaneous enthusiasm. He was using this moment to do several things at once. He was reminding people of his own ongoing tension with 50 Cent without having to dedicate significant creative energy to addressing it directly. He was positioning himself as someone with taste and judgment by publicly co-signing work that was being widely praised for its quality. And he was keeping his name in a conversation that was generating enormous amounts of engagement and attention without putting himself at risk of being dragged into the center of a conflict that was not primarily his to fight. That calculation was being noticed and appreciated by people who understood how the politics of hip-hop visibility work. In an environment where attention is the most valuable currency and every move is instantly analyzed for what it reveals about your position and your loyalties, Ross was threading a needle with considerable skill. He was present enough to matter, but restrained enough to maintain the ability to escalate or step back depending on how the situation developed. His comments had already become some of the most discussed elements of the entire saga, which meant he had achieved maximum visibility with minimum vulnerability. And that is a genuinely difficult balance to strike in the middle of a beef this heated and this public. The conversation about what Ross's involvement meant for 50 Cent was becoming more pointed as the days passed. Some analysts were arguing that having Ross visibly aligned with the opposing side created a psychological dimension to the situation that went beyond the immediate lyrical exchange. It was a reminder of accumulated history. It was a signal that the opposition to 50 Cent in this moment was not limited to one family with a specific grievance, but connected to a broader network of unresolved tensions that had been building for years. Whether 50 Cent viewed it that way, or whether he was genuinely as unbothered as his social media suggested, was something that only he knew for certain, but the speculation around that question was itself fueling the narrative in ways that kept everyone locked in and hungry for whatever was going to happen next. Whatever was going to happen next felt closer than it had at any point since the situation first exploded into public consciousness, and that feeling of imminence was doing something electric to the energy online. The collective anticipation had reached a pitch where even small developments were being treated as major events. A single social media post from any of the principals could send the conversation spiraling in an entirely new direction within minutes. A comment liked or unliked, a story posted and then deleted, a follow or an unfollow, all of it was being monitored and interpreted with an intensity that would have seemed excessive if the stakes did not feel so genuinely high. This was the nature of modern hip-hop drama at its most consuming, and everyone who was caught up in it knew they were watching something that would be referenced and analyzed for years to come, regardless of how it ultimately resolved. The critics who had been breaking down the three family tracks were starting to reach some consistent conclusions, and those conclusions were not particularly comfortable for the people who had been insisting that skill and quality were not really the point of this exchange. The point, according to those voices, was purely about sending a message and controlling the narrative. But the critics kept coming back to the work itself and saying that the work was genuinely good, that it deserved to be evaluated on its own terms, and that dismissing it as merely strategic missed something important about what made it land so hard with such a wide audience. Dominique in particular was receiving the kind of detailed technical praise that artists work their entire careers to earn, with people pointing out specific moments in Miss Jackson where his word choices and delivery created effects that went beyond the obvious target of the track and touched something more universal about loyalty and protection and the lengths people will go to when they feel their family has been disrespected. That universality was part of what made the situation so compelling to people who were not even particularly invested in the specific personalities involved. The story had found a frequency that resonated beyond the core hip-hop audience, pulling in casual observers who recognized something familiar in the image of a family standing together in the face of opposition. It did not matter if you knew every detail of the backstory between T and 50 Cent. It did not matter if you had followed Rick Ross's career closely enough to understand every layer of his involvement. The basic human drama at the
center of the story was accessible and emotionally legible to anyone who had ever felt the instinct to close ranks around the people they loved when something or someone threatened them. That accessibility was what turned a hip-hop beef into a genuinely viral cultural moment that was being discussed in spaces well outside the usual boundaries of rap commentary. 50 Cent's team was clearly aware of how the narrative was developing because the social media activity from his side began showing subtle but noticeable shifts in tone and approach. The humor was still there, because humor was too central to his brand and his strategy to disappear entirely. But there was something underneath it that felt more focused and more deliberate than the casual, unbothered energy he had been projecting in the earlier days of the situation. Posts that seemed at first glance like throwaway jokes revealed on closer inspection a very specific awareness of exactly what was being said about him and exactly which elements of the opposition's narrative he was choosing to engage with versus which ones he was choosing to let sit unanswered. The choices themselves were communicating something, and the people who had been studying his competitive style for years were starting to piece together what they thought that something was. The theory that was gaining the most traction among the most attentive observers was that 50 Cent was waiting for a specific kind of opening, not just any moment to respond, but a moment where a response would land with maximum impact and minimum risk of being absorbed or deflected by the momentum the other side had built. He had always been better at timing than people gave him credit for, and his history suggested that he understood intuitively that striking too early in a situation like this could actually diminish the impact of whatever he chose to do. By letting the conversation breathe and expand and fill up with the anticipation of his response, he was in some ways building the audience for whatever came next, in a way that would have been impossible if he had reacted immediately and impulsively in the first hours after King dropped his opening track. King himself was navigating the aftermath of his entry into the situation with a combination of confidence and awareness that was being noted by people who had initially underestimated what he brought to the table. The pressure of being T.I.'s son in this specific context would have buckled a lot of people, but King was showing that he had absorbed something real from growing up in the environment he came from. He was not just riding his father's energy, he was generating his own, and the distinction was visible to anyone who was paying close enough to separate the individual voices within the family's coordinated response. His emotional investment in what he was doing came through clearly in everything he posted and everything he said publicly about the situation, and that authenticity was connecting with fans in a way that pure technical skill alone could not have achieved. The broader conversation about where the lines were drawn in hip-hop rivalries had also reached a point of genuine complexity that was uncomfortable for people who preferred clear and simple moral frameworks. Because the truth was that both sides of this dispute had moments in their history that invited scrutiny if you looked closely enough. This was not a situation where one party was obviously righteous and the other was obviously wrong. It was a situation where two sets of people with long histories and strong personalities and deeply held ideas about respect and legacy were coming at each other from positions that each made internal sense, even if they were incompatible with each other. The fans who were insisting on simple narratives were being challenged by the fans who were willing to sit with the complexity, and that tension within the audience was itself part of the story. Rick Ross made one final move that brought everything into sharp focus and reminded everyone why his 3 words had broken the internet in the first place. He posted something that was longer than his previous comments, but still economical in the way that only someone who truly understands the rhythm of social media communication can be. He connected his support for what T.I.'s family had done to his own long history with 50 Cent, not in a way that was angry or grievance-filled, but in a way that was almost matter-of-fact, as if he was simply stating a reality that anyone paying attention should have already understood. He was saying that when you have the kind of history he and 50 Cent had, you did not need much of an excuse to make your position clear when a new chapter of that history was being written in public. And his position was clear. He thought the family had brought it. He thought Miss Jackson was quality. He thought the cultural moment belonged to the side that had been willing to put
creative work into it, rather than retreating to the safety of memes and social media commentary. The response to that post was enormous and immediate. Supporters of T.'s family treated it as a validation that went beyond one man's opinion and represented something broader about where the culture stood in this particular moment. Supporters of 50 Cent treated it as evidence that Ross was desperate for relevance and using someone else's beef to insert himself into a conversation he had no real business being part of. Both reactions were predictable, and both reactions missed something important, which was that Ross's sustained involvement had already changed the shape of the story, regardless of how you felt about his motives. He had taken what might have remained a relatively contained family drama and connected it to a much larger and much older set of tensions that had never fully resolved, and by doing that he had guaranteed that the current situation would not resolve quickly or cleanly either. The streaming numbers were telling their own story throughout all of this. Every new development in the public narrative sent listeners back to the music, and the music was holding up under that repeated scrutiny in a way that suggested the family's releases had genuine longevity beyond the drama that had initially driven people to them. Miss Jackson in particular was being added to playlists and shared in contexts that had nothing to do with the beef,
which was the clearest possible sign that Dominique had made something that transcended its original purpose and found an audience that was responding to it purely on its own terms. That kind of organic expansion was something that no amount of strategic timing or coordinated rollout could manufacture. It either happened or it did not. And in this case, it was happening in a way that was making even skeptics reassess their initial dismissal of the family's creative output as merely reactive. As the days continued to pass and the situation remained unresolved in any definitive sense, something interesting began to emerge from the sustained attention that both sides were receiving. The rivalry, if you could call it that at this point, had become a kind of ongoing creative and cultural event that people were following the way they followed a serialized story. Each new development was a new episode. Each new post or track or comment was a new plot point that sent the audience back to everything that had come before it to look for connections and patterns and foreshadowing they might have missed. The artists involved had become characters in a narrative that was larger than any of them individually, and the audience had become collaborators in that narrative by bringing their own interpretations and emotional investments to every new chapter. That was the real measure of how significant the moment had become, not the stream counts or the blog coverage or even the quality of the music itself, but the degree to which it had captured people's imaginations and refused to let go. So here we are, and the question that started this whole conversation is still hanging in the air with more weight behind it now than when we first asked it. 3 words from Rick Ross broke the internet during a war that was already burning hot, and what those 3 words revealed was something bigger than a comment section cosign. They revealed that this situation was never really just about one family and one rivalry. It was about accumulated history finally finding a new moment to express itself. It was about the next generation stepping into spaces that the previous generation created and making those spaces their own. It was about the way that loyalty looks when it stops being theoretical and becomes something you actually act on in public, where everyone can see it and judge it and form opinions about it that they will carry with them long after the specific details of this particular moment have faded. What happens next is genuinely unknown, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this so compelling to watch. Will 50 Cent respond in a way that resets the entire conversation and reminds everyone why his reputation as a competitor is what it is? Will King or Dominique come back with something that builds on the momentum they have already established and pushes the situation into territory that nobody has mapped yet? Will Rick Ross go further than 3 words and a handful of comments and step fully into the arena with something that makes his position impossible to ignore, even for the people who have been trying to dismiss his involvement as opportunistic? All of these possibilities are real, and all of them are being discussed with genuine excitement by the people who have been following this story from the beginning. What we know for certain is that the culture is watching, and the culture has opinions. The comment sections are full and getting fuller. The blogs are refreshing their pages every
hour looking for the next development. The fans are locked in on both sides, passionate and vocal, and unwilling to concede a single point to the opposition. And somewhere in the middle of all of that noise, real artists are making real decisions about what they want to say and how they want to say it, and what kind of legacy they want this moment to represent when people look back on it years from now. Now we want to hear from you directly, because your opinion on this is what makes the conversation worth having. Do you think Rick Ross's 3 words genuinely shifted the balance of power in this rivalry, or was it a moment that felt bigger than it actually was in the long run? Do you think T.I.'s family has done something historically significant with their coordinated releases, or do you think 50 Cent is about to remind everyone why he has never lost one of these in the way that matters most? Drop everything you are thinking in the comments right now, because this community has some of the sharpest takes in the game, and this story deserves the full weight of your perspective. If you have been watching this situation unfold and you want to stay ahead of every new development as it happens, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. This saga is nowhere near over, and we are going to be here for every single chapter of it as it unfolds.